I'm going to talk to you today about the topic of self-harm and suicidal behavior in adolescence. And I have no conflict of interest, but many people who I'm very grateful that they gave me a lot of money to do my research. They are all labeled here. When I'm talking about self-harm, I'm basically talking about two different types of self-harm that we now distinguish according to the DSM-5. One is the so-called non-suicidal self-injury, which you see, it's one of the most common forms is cutting, self-cutting. And the other type of self-harm is what you call a suicide attempt, or what the DSM is now calling suicidal behavior disorder. I'll just give you a brief overview over this lecture. I'll start with the prevalence and cause of these behaviors. I'll then give you a little bit of information on the mechanisms, basically, of development and maintenance of self-harm behavior. I'm not going to talk too much about biology today because I thought I'm going to have this talk a little bit more from a clinical perspective, and then we'll have a lot of time to talk about treatment and prevention of self-harm and suicidal behavior. So, self-injury is a very common phenomenon nowadays among adolescents. This is data from an 11-country European study where you can quite easily see that almost 30% of European adolescents have already self-injured in their life, and the red parts is the ones who've done that repetitively. So that's approximately 5 to 10% of our adolescents who engage in repetitive self-injury. We have quite remarkable country differences. It's always hard to tell in multi-center studies whether they come from sampling issues, whether they come from cultural differences, whether they come from also issues of response behavior in questionnaires, but there seems to be a little bit of an enhanced prevalence of these behaviors in the countries who are very industrialized and who are more or less considered as high socioeconomic. We have high rates in the UK also, in France, in Germany, but obviously, as you can see, also in many other countries. The prevalence of suicidal behavior, so of suicide attempts, the lifetime prevalence is also quite high. You can also see huge differences. Very prominent in this data was Israel, with a very high prevalence of suicide attempts, but also the other countries. We are ranging between 5 and 10% of adolescents who have already tried to commit suicide at the age of 15. Self-harm peaks in mid-adolescence. We are lacking a lot of good longitudinal studies in the field, but this is a review that basically summarized all the short-term longitudinal studies that we have. And what you can quite easily see is that basically until mid-adolescence, the prevalence of self-harm rises and then declines into young adulthood. And that is something that has previously also been shown by Paul Moran, who conducted a very nice study published in The Lancet that showed that actually from the age of 15, self-harm is declining dramatically into young adulthood. But then we continue to have a more or less stable prevalence rate of 1% of people who continue self-harm during their life. Self-harm and suicidal behavior largely overlap, and they also overlap with other risk-taking behaviors. What you can see here, actually, is a sample from a longitudinal study of around 515 adolescents. And what we did is we used frequency types of behaviors and also the cause of behaviors to determine different risk clusters for the different behaviors: substance misuse, suicidality, and self-harm. And what you see here is the different high-risk clusters from the three behaviors. And actually, the most important finding is that they hugely overlap. So if you are at high risk of self-harm, you are at high risk of being suicidal, and you are also at high risk of substance misuse. What is very interesting is if you have a look of the trajectories, the longitudinal trajectories of these different behaviors, because they are pretty different, you can see here that from the age of 15 until young adulthood, the high-risk clusters, which are always red, are declining, as you have seen in the studies that I showed you before. But the trajectory for substance misuse, and remember, it's almost the same individuals because of this huge overlap, the trajectory of substance misuse is very much going up. Yeah? So what we always need to consider, and that's one of the messages that I also want to share with you, is self-injury and suicidal behavior often go along, but often we also have symptom shifts, particularly to substance misuse. So only because one of your adolescent clients stops self-injury doesn't necessarily mean that they are healthy. They may also do something else. If you have a look at these different trajectories of self-injury in adolescence, again from the same longitudinal data set, you see that actually quite a huge proportion, almost 25%, they have self-injured at the age of 15, but they stop self-injury in the long term. And you have this 10% who maintain self-injury for a couple of years. You have a few who have basically a late onset, and obviously you have quite a proportion who have never self-injured in their life. The interesting thing is now, if we have a look at the trajectory of self-injury, that does quite well predict the issue of severe suicidal behavior at the age of 17 or 18. And you see this here in this slide. These are the ones, this is the suicide risk for severe suicide plans and attempts at those who have never self-injured. This is the one of those who maintain self-injury for a longer time. But most interesting, we have the suicide risk for those who went into remission of self-injury, so who stopped self-injury again. Yeah? And this is also something that I want to show you because self-injury is quite a good marker of suicide risk. Yeah? And that does apply to the onset and maintenance of self-injury, but it also applies to the remission of self-injury. I'm talking a little bit now about mechanisms. The main question is, why actually does a young person begin to self-injure, and why do they maintain self-injury? So basically, there are three prerequisites for the development and maintenance of self-injury. First, you need to have an unbearable emotional state before self-injury. That's very important because usually people don't start self-injuring if they feel good. The next prerequisite is the expectation of relief after self-injury. Even if I feel very bad, I don't cut myself if I don't have the expectation that after cutting, something will be better. And then the third prerequisite is reduced self-control. Because even if I'm in an unbearable emotional state and I have the expectation that self-injury helps, I can still make a decision that in the long term it doesn't solve my problems, and I can still decide not to cut myself. Let's have a look at these three prerequisites. The unbearable emotional state. That's again data from the very large sample from a European Union study. It's more than 12,000 adolescents. And what you can very easily see here is that self-injury is associated with almost every type of child and adolescent psychopathology. Very much with depression, very much with anxiety, but also with conduct disorder problems, with attention hyperactivity problems, social problems. If you have NSSI, you're at high risk of suffering from any kind of emotional and behavioral problems. This here is a study from a methodology that we call ecological momentary assessment, which gives us the possibility not only to ask for emotion regulation in terms of self-report questionnaires or interviews, but to see how emotions change on a day-to-day basis and even on an hour-to-hour basis using smartphone technology. What you can see here is a so-called heat map. That means that we have handed over smartphones to the adolescents, and every hour they filled in a little online questions about their current emotional states, about their arousal, about the valence of their emotions. They also filled answers about their urge to self-injury, whether they had actually self-injured. And what you can see here on this heat map is we have done that on 4 consecutive days. There have been 12 assessments per day. And actually this graph is quite clearly showing what self-injury is about. The healthy controls look pretty green and they look pretty one-colored, you know. What we learn out of that is healthy adolescents are not emotionally unstable. They're actually pretty stable in their emotions and they're usually pretty happy. And what we also see is that those with NSSI, they are a lot more unhappy, but in particularly, they are changing their emotions almost constantly during the day. There's probably 2 individuals with severe major depression in here, but all the others have a very colorful picture, and you can do statistics with that and see that obviously we have a very high degree of emotional instability, emotional dysregulation in those individuals. What is even more important is that with EMA technology, you can have a look at the time course of emotions, urge to self-injury, and affects. So what we have done in the next analysis is we have taken always 2 time points at each possible time, and we have assessed whether they have injured here, here they were asked, did you self-injure in the last hour? So we have assessed the negative effect here, and we have assessed the urge of self-injury before and the negative affect before. With 2 hypotheses. 1, obviously urge to self-injury and negative affect precede non-suicidal self-injury. Hypothesis 2, we should have reduced negative affect after NSSI. Because, and that's very important, we have talked about this, they only do this behavior because they expect some kind of benefit from him. And one of the most expected benefits, and that what they mostly report, is that they regulate their affects and reduce their tension with non-suicidal self-injury. So let's have a look at this. The study characteristics, 134 patients, 12 to 18 years old, and we in total recorded 66 incidents of NSSI during our study. And as you can see, the incidence of NSSI happened mostly in the evening hours. That's very typical, that they often self-harm a little bit more towards the night. And this is a graph that basically shows and compares the urge to self-injury that the adolescents reported before they actually self-injured compared to their urge of self-injury in all other hours during these 4 days. And what that slide actually very well shows is that adolescents with self-injury, they are very well capable to declare their urge of self-injury, and that can be used for treatment. You know, if you try to treat adolescents with self-injury, a lot is about knowing when they are going to self-harm, collecting information about early warning signs. And this picture clearly shows you that most adolescents are capable to say, yes, I have a very high urge of self-injury, and that this high urge of self-injury precedes the actual incident of self-injury. We are now coming to the negative emotions, and this is the graph that should actually illustrate how it works. 1 hour before, like this green line is the line that shows the mean of all affects across the 4 days at each time point. So already 1 hour before, we have a slightly increased negative affect, but it's still within the range. But then, before self-injury occurs, we have a significantly and highly increased negative affect, which is consistent with our hypothesis. But the thing that actually was very surprising to us, that after self-injury, the negative affect is even significantly elevated. Yeah. And that contradicts previous research from experimental studies where we can clearly show that if we have individuals with non-suicidal self-injury and they are exposed to pain, they usually benefit in terms of affect. They show reduced affect. So why do we find this? What we don't know in this study is when the actual self-harm incident occurred between those two time points. They are 1 hour away from each other. So what I can definitely tell you is that, and you can tell that to your patients because it may be very helpful, if you self-injure, I can promise you at least 59 minutes after your self-injury, you will feel worse. And that also shows us that actually self-injury is very short-lasting. Yeah? It's not that all the hypothesis is wrong, that it's an affect regulation method. But what we need to understand is that our reward system in the brain reacts to very short reliefs. Yeah? The relief from self-injury lasts a couple of seconds. If we are lucky, maybe a couple of minutes. But already, and that's, I think, the fascinating thing, 59 minutes after, they feel a lot worse. And they feel even worse than in the hour before the self-injury. Let's get only very quickly to the last idea of reduced self-control. The part in the brain that we often suggest and that we actually also know is associated with top-down self-regulation is the frontal lobe. So what we have done is we have done a study in self-injurers compared to healthy controls using functional infrared spectroscopy. It is not an MRI technology. It's using infrared light that goes into the brain and then is very similar to fMRI, reflected depending on the oxygenation of the blood. The advantage of FNIRS technology is that we can do it everywhere. You just need a cap. You don't need a scanner. The disadvantage is that we are not able to have a look at deeper brain structures, for example, the limbic system. But for the frontal brain, it works quite well. And what you can see here is the unpublished and preliminary results of an FNIRS study on NSSI, where we can clearly show that actually the NSSI individuals show a very high variance of frontal lobe activity, in general a significantly lower frontal lobe activity, and particularly interesting, the frontal lobe activity is correlated with the emotional instability that these clients report. So there's some evidence that also the third prerequisite has a biological background. As I said, I'm not going to talk too much about biology and mechanisms. I want to talk quite a lot about possibilities of treatment and prevention. Dennis Ogrin from the UK has done a very nice comprehensive meta-analysis on the prevention of self-harm by psychotherapeutic interventions. And what he found is actually, yes, we have capable treatments to prevent self-harm in adolescents compared to treatment as usual. You can see that here. But also interesting, because I said I'm also talking about suicidal behavior. In the same meta-analysis, he showed, unfortunately, that we have no good evidence by now that we can also reduce suicide attempts with more or less the same treatments. However, we also need to recognize that there are far less studies on the outcome of suicide attempts, and also suicide attempt is a little bit more tricky as an outcome because it occurs a lot less often than non-suicidal self-injury. So probably that contributes also to this result. Nonetheless, I think there's also hope for the prevention of suicide attempts. There has been a very nice study published recently that did a cognitive behavior therapy program, a very comprehensive cognitive behavior therapy program, but with a lot of very specific family involvement. Yeah. And as you can see here, they really had a very nice effect of much lower probability for a suicide attempt than in the enhanced treatment as usual, which shows that actually at the moment, cognitive behavior therapy together with a very structured and very enhanced family involvement may be one of the best bets that we have for the prevention of suicidal behavior in the field. What we have done recently is we have done a randomized controlled trial also on CBT, but on a very brief CBT program. Why have we done that? The idea is that still, and that applies worldwide, more for some countries than for others, but I think we can almost talk somehow it applies for every country. We have the problem that we have so many patients with self-harm, and we do not have enough resources to treat them. Many patients with self-harm do not get any adequate treatment at all. And while we have very nice intervention strategies such as dialectical behavior therapy or mentalization-based treatment, probably only very few self-harmers are lucky to enter a specific DBT or MBT program. So the idea of this trial was basically to try whether with a very simple program that targets the symptom of self-harm, we can reduce non-suicidal self-injury and also suicide attempts, so that we would have something that can be disseminated and that can be used by trainees, by unexperienced psychotherapists and doctors, that has a brief duration and is thereby cost-effective. This program is called the Cutting Down Program. It has originally been developed in the UK by Lucy Taylor and colleagues, and it basically consists of 4 modules. The first module is basically some sort of psychoeducation and commitment work. Then we just have something that many of us might call behavior analysis. So the basis is basically to understand the feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that surround the issue of self-harm. Then we have a part on coping and skills, and then basically that's all integrated into all-day life. So this is not rocket science, this is very easy. It's 8 to 12 sessions, and it can be applied by trainees. The RCT aimed to compare the Cutting Down program to what I call a high-quality treatment as usual. Why do I say high-quality treatment? First of all, often treatments as usual mainly consist of waiting lists, because if you go into a treatment as usual, you basically have to wait for a couple of months until you start. So what we did is we made contracts with psychotherapists in the field who said that they would offer a standard CBT psychotherapy within 2 weeks. And the other thing is that they were all kind of usually experienced psychotherapists, or if they were less experienced, they had very regular supervision. So what was also high quality is that the treatment as usual went a lot longer. It was 25 to 50 sessions, which they received. We had then a post-line assessment after the Cutting Down program. It was 3 to 4 months after we started, which was basically a mid-treatment assessment in the high-quality treatment as usual, and then 6 months later, we had a follow-up. We recruited 96 who we assessed for eligibility, and then we finally randomized 74 patients, allocated them to either the treatment as usual or the Cutting Down program. I must say I really had a fascinating PhD student who is now a postdoc, because she managed to get all 100% into the follow-up examinations, which is really fantastic. And this is the main outcome of the study. So what you can basically see here is there's absolutely no group differences at 6-month follow-up in terms of the reduction of NSSI, but we have a very high effect size regarding the reduction of the frequency of NSSI. These effect sizes here are comparable to the recent DBTA and MBTA trials in the field. What you can also see here is that we have a significant time point group interaction in the way that the Cutting Down program was a lot faster regarding the reduction of self-injury, and results were kept stable after discharge from the Cutting Down program until the follow-up, whereas the decrease in self-injury was quite constant and a lot slower in the high-quality treatment as usual. And again, you need to consider that these people here had much more treatment sessions than the ones in the cutting down program. This is the change of suicide attempts. We didn't assess suicide attempts at the post-line, like we assessed it, but because it was only a 3-month period, we didn't have enough incidents to make meaningful comparisons. But what you can see here, it's only trend significant level, but the CDP was even a bit more successful in reducing suicide attempts towards follow-up than the high-quality treatment as usual. So the overall message basically is that, yes, with a brief cognitive behavioral treatment program, we can reduce self-harm and suicide attempts. We may be even able to have similar reductions as much larger treatments. So I'm not saying that everyone can be treated with 8 to 12 sessions, and that particular targets the behavior of self-harm. But I think particularly if we think about stepped care approaches, where we give something small to everyone, and then only continue with more intensive treatments for those who need it, this may be a very meaningful approach. I'm now talking a little bit more about prevention, and we're going to suicide prevention. The project that I've already shown you a few baseline data from is the project called Saving and Empowering Young Lives in Europe. It was a project that was conducted in 11 European countries, and the aim was clearly suicide prevention. Sorry, there's one German sentence in here that shouldn't be. So it was more than 11,000 adolescents between 14 and 16 years. And what they received basically is they received in 4 different groups that were randomized. They received either a gatekeeper training, which means that teachers and school staff were trained to respond to suicidal behavior or to suicidal thoughts and crisis. They received a youth awareness of mental health program, 5 sessions in the class where students themselves received information about crisis, depression, suicidal behavior, how they could get help or how they could refer friends to help. We did a professional screening where we screened for whole issues of risk-taking and psychopathology and then referred them, so invited them to a clinical interview and referred them, and we had a control group. And these 250 were per country, so in the end, we had around 3,000 to 3,000 adolescents in each group. Before I come to the results of the group comparisons, what we also did in the SEYLE study, because it was requested by the Ethical Board of the European Union, was a so-called emergency cases screening. So from the overall sample, which was more than the 12,000 adolescents, we did a screening on acute suicide urges, plans, or attempts within the past 2 weeks. And we did that across all the 4 groups because that was just a requirement that we take care of those at acute risk. In the end, we ended up with 516 screening cases, 4.2%, and we invited those and we really encouraged them to come to a clinical interview and advisory session. Yeah. We did not only call them once or mail them once, we really stalked them. Yeah, we tried and tried and tried to somehow get them to talk to us on the phone, in person, everything that was possible. But in the end, and that's a little bit of the sad message, we still had 62.5 non-participants, yeah, who simply refused and who we did not get to talk with us in a child and adolescent psychiatric department. What I can show you is that those who attended the interview had some benefits. We clearly had 1 year later, so that was a 12-month follow-up, we clearly had higher numbers of help seeking at professional mental health services. But when I say we had significantly higher numbers, I still want to draw your attention to the fact that still we only had 25% of those who we had in a clinical interview after acute suicide risk who followed our advice to get into professional help. It was significantly larger, but it's still absolutely not sufficient. and we had a significant higher decrease in suicidality. Effect sizes were also relatively small. So these are really results that are somehow interesting, but they also show that we are we still need to go a long way because we have this huge treatment gap in self-harming and suicidal adolescents who we simply don't get into treatment, so it's difficult for our professions to help them. There is other prevention programs that work via screening interventions, for example in the US, the Suicide Prevention Program. And what they do a few things a little bit better, and I'm just telling that because if you think about doing suicide prevention, I think you should do a few things different from we did in SEYLE. You can see that here, what they really managed to do is that they really found a significant decline and a actually quite meaningful decline of suicide attempts in the intervention group compared to the post group. They have a strong increase of suicide attempts, which is related to age in the control group, but here they were pretty stable. So why does that work better in the US? I think the reason why it works better is because they try and do all the interviews and advisory things at school. They have school counselors, so they take people and individuals and adolescents where they are. Child and adolescent psychiatry or clinics are not involved. And I think that leads to much higher participation rates, and we need to consider things like this as well. We've done a sub-analysis on our emergency cases screening, and we found a very strong correlation between the time to travel from their school to our intervention center and the participation rate. So we shouldn't underestimate how much 60 minutes of travel may, kind of get into the way of receiving help for acutely suicidal adolescents. So this is now the results from the overall SEYLE study. It's the incidence of new suicide attempts in the 4 different groups. And what you can clearly see is we have the control group with most incidence of suicide attempts. We have the gatekeeper training and the professional screening here in the middle. And we have the lowest incidence of suicide attempts in the Youth Awareness of Mental Health program. In numbers, the odds ratio at 12-month follow-up compared to the control group was 0.45, so more than a half reduction of suicide attempts in the Youth Awareness of Mental Health group compared to the control group. This paper has been published in The Lancet because it is basically the first large comprehensive study that showed that school-based prevention of suicide attempts is really possible. We can do it. And the big problem that we now have is that although we have these results, it is remarkably difficult for many of our centers to get money for some kind of dissemination of these interventions. I just want to take the remaining time to talk a little bit of a topic that is a little bit of one of my hard topics, because it's one of the, I think, most prominent and most important risk factors for suicide attempts in adolescents. That's bullying. You see here the results of a meta-analysis that clearly shows that with a huge effect size, bullying is associated with adolescent suicide attempts. And what we did in a recent study, this is also very preliminary. The study is we're still in the data analyzing phase. What we did is, in a sample of almost 8,000 students, we conducted the so-called Olveus bullying prevention program. It's a very internationally recognized school-based program to reduce bullying, and the implementation lasts around 18 months, and it is comprehensive in the way that you really try to change the school climate. You work with the teachers, you work with the parents, you work with the students, you work with the directorate of the schools. It's quite effective. And what you can see here, first of all, this is baseline data from this study, is that obviously, again, with a very large effect size, bullying victims show much more suicide attempts than those who are not affected by bullying. There's a recent, also very interesting study from a professor called Dieter Wolke, who could clearly show that if you combine early maltreatment and bullying into models to predict suicidality or other mental health adversities, bullying is the stronger predictor of mental health problems than early maltreatment. And we really need to consider bullying as one type of maltreatment. What I want to show you now is within this bullying prevention program, how does suicide attempts 1 and 2 years later relate to the change of bullying? Perhaps I haven't had a slide for that. The program was enabled to substantially reduce bullying overall. And you can clearly see here that you have a significant change of suicide attempts in the group who transitioned from bullying to no bullying experiences. However, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that actually, unfortunately, it seems more difficult to reduce the damage that has already been done than to do the damage. Because those who, despite the program, still transitioned from no bullying to bullying, they have a remarkable increase of suicidal behavior, and also those who were already bullied and did not benefit from the program, they even showed a very significant and remarkably decrease. So the take-home message from this is reduction of bullying can significantly reduce suicidal behavior, but probably we need to do more efforts to even prevent the incidence of bullying, because the damage that can be done via bullying is not so easy to reduce again. That is basically everything I wanted to say. I need to thank very many people who conducted this research with me together, my staff members who are working very hard and do excellent work, and all my collaborators. And I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.